I'm Dave Simon. I'm a lawyer, an author, and an advocate for sustainable consumption. I'm speaking at the Real Truth About Health conference in 2015 about my book, Meatonomics, which looks at the economic consequences of meat and dairy production in the United States, and in particular, some of the ways that animal food producers control and manipulate consumers to buy much more animal foods than they would otherwise. Several years ago, I sent an email to a bunch of friends with a factory farming video embedded, and I asked them to watch the video and tell me what they thought. And I got back sort of a range of responses, all the responses that you might expect, everywhere from incredulity to denial. And the response that particularly interested me was from the dean of a law school, who wrote back and said that the behavior that he saw in the video was deplorable and despicable, but in his mind it was illegal, and that meant that it was not evidence of a systemic problem. It was anomalous or exceptional. I didn't know whether that was true at the time, but when I looked into it, what I found out shocked me, and that is that over the last several decades in this country, animal food producers have embarked on a very aggressive campaign to emasculate virtually all of the anti-cruelty protections that once applied to farm animals. That means that farm animals have virtually no protection whatsoever from cruelty. I spent 3 years researching this book, and I looked at published peer-reviewed studies, I looked at government reports from agencies like the USDA, the FDA, the United Nations. I looked at NGO reports from groups like Ocean and other environmental organizations, and the book has more than 700 endnotes, and wherever anything that I assert has potential to be controversial, I have footnoted it to a source that supports what I'm saying. One of the consequences of animal food production in the United States is that producers offload the vast majority of their costs onto society, so that consumers and taxpayers end up paying their production costs. For every $1 of animal foods sold at retail, another $1.70 is imposed on consumers and taxpayers in the form of externalized costs. So what that means is, when McDonald's sells a Big Mac for $5, there's another $8 in externalized costs that the rest of us bear, whether we eat Big Macs or not. A Big Mac, therefore, really costs $13. And because McDonald's charges only $5 for it, we can say that the prices of Big Macs and other animal foods are artificially low. Now, the law of demand, which is a very simple economic principle, says when prices come down, consumption goes up. So, because the prices of animal foods are artificially low, and in fact, on an inflation-adjusted basis, have fallen consistently over the last century, consumers have responded by consuming more and more of them. Consumers have doubled their consumption of meat in the United States from 100 pounds per person in 1935 to just under 200 pounds per person today. And they're simply doing that because they're responding to those economic cues. They're responding to lower prices and they're buying more. We subsidize animal agriculture in this country with about $38 billion in state, federal, and local subsidies. That's a bigger number than some commentators propose. One of the reasons the number that I've calculated is a little larger than some of the others is that I've included subsidies to corn and soybeans in my calculation. In the United States, 80% of the corn and 70% of the soybeans that we raise is used to feed livestock that is raised for food. So we simply have to include those subsidy costs because that allows animal food producers to buy that feed more cheaply. Every year in the United States, approximately $414 billion of hidden costs is externalized or imposed on American consumers and taxpayers. Those are costs associated with things like environmental damage, subsidies, healthcare costs associated with treating diseases that are known to arise from consuming diets that are high in animal foods like cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. To put that number in perspective, $414 billion, that's half of what we spend on Social Security in this country every year. It's 1/4 of Canada's gross domestic product. It's an enormous number. There are two ways that we can think about solving these problems. The first is on an individual level. People can simply decide to eat less animal products or to give them up completely. As many of the speakers at this conference have already said, doctors, dietitians, and others, we don't need animal food in our diet, and in fact, we're much better off without it. For example, we can enjoy cholesterol levels that are 25% lower if we're vegan, body mass index 18% lower, and we can increase our longevity. So that's one step that we can take, is to go vegan or give up half of our meat or take some important step toward changing our diet. Another important step at the institutional level is that we could start taxing food that contains animal products. I actually recommend a 50% tax in my book. And I calculate that if we impose a 50% tax on meat products, so that, for example, a Big Mac, instead of $5, would cost $7.50, that together with some other institutional changes, like giving up subsidies and some other programs, we could reduce consumption of animal foods in this country by 44%. That would have tremendous benefits. For example, we could save 170,000 human lives every year. We could save 26 billion land and marine animals' lives every year. The challenge to affecting institutional change in the United States is that our state and federal lawmakers are, in many cases, beholden to lobbying interests. It's challenging to get reelected to office, and so one must accept campaign donations, and as a result, one becomes obligated to toe the line. But it's difficult to get change done. However, lawmakers have said repeatedly in polls and surveys that they are more likely to respond to a constituent who calls or visits their office and speaks about an issue that concerns them than they are to a lobbyist. So if people take this issue seriously and contact their lawmakers, there is a likelihood that down the road somewhere we can actually get something done. Well, I think that we're seeing plant-based diets become more and more popular. One of the latest polls I've seen says that something like 8 million Americans out of just over 300 million today are vegan or vegetarian. That's a lot of people, and they're all doing great. They have better health, they have better energy, they have better attitudes. I think that increasingly we're seeing, for reasons of ethics, nutrition, environment, and now increasingly economics, it just makes sense to be on a vegan diet, or at least a plant-based diet that's largely vegan. Well, every year that we continue on our current path, we are deferring the costs associated with animal food production, those externalized costs of $414 billion. And it's just like deferred maintenance on your house or your car. It makes that item run worse. And at some point, you've got to pay the bill. If you don't change your oil, at some point your car is just going to stop working. In this country, we are heaping environmental problems on top of environmental problems, and we're heaping healthcare problems on top of healthcare problems. We're just getting sicker and sicker. 2 in 3 Americans are overweight. 1 in 3 is obese. 1 in 3 Americans has heart disease when you include hypertension or high blood pressure. It's just getting worse and worse, and we have to take action to reverse that.